Hello and welcome to Beyond The Capsule, the podcast brought to you to demystify the science on all things health and wellness. Designed by experts, created to empower you to live better and longer.
Okay, hi, I am Helen Drake, the Clinical Education Manager at Cytoplan, and today on Beyond the Capsule, we are delighted to introduce Dr. Trudi Edington. So Trudi is a clinical psychologist, CBT therapist, mindfulness practitioner with research interests in neuropsychology, psychopharmacology, cognitive neuroscience, and cognitive rehabilitation. So Trudi completed her degree, PhD and postdoctoral research at the University of Sussex, working with individuals with long-term health conditions. She is now a reader at St George's University and also works clinically with individuals with traumatic brain injury, hydrocephalus, spina bifida, chronic fatigue syndrome, trauma, neurodivergence, anxiety disorders, and dementia. So we're really, really excited to have Trudi here today. So welcome along, Trudi, and thanks so much for coming. It's really great to see you.
You're very welcome. And Helen, thank you so much for the invitation. Hearing that back, I'm just, apologies for all those long words.
No problem. I was worried I'd got hydrocephalus wrong, but we'll see.
No, absolutely perfect.
Excellent. Well, before we get into it, it'd be really great just to have a bit of a background into your history and how you got into neuropsychology and cognitive function, and then leading on to what sparked your interest in mindfulness, which is what we're going to be focusing on today particularly.
Sure. I feel really blessed in terms of my professional career because I started out as a registered nurse. So I trained at St Mary's Hospital in Paddington. And within that sort of field, it was just really nice for me to be able to work with people who had physical health difficulties. But as you were working as a nurse, you realise that so much of that is related to people's circumstances, their fears, their worries, their anxiety. And as a nurse, that you play a big role in terms of allaying some of those fears and sharing information. So I'd always felt very compassionate person and enjoyed that role. And after I finished my training, I worked in America for 2 years, still as a nurse, but worked in Los Angeles in a downtown hospital, which was fabulous. It was a really exciting time. And it really shows a difference in terms of how you do things in your own country, in your own values, and how things can be different. So when I came back to the UK, I decided that I wanted to really explore psychology in a little bit more detail. So I took a degree in psychology at Sussex and carried on my studies by taking on a PhD, which felt enormous undertaking, but I absolutely loved it because it allowed me to think about what was actually going on sort of in the brain itself. And the way that we could actually explore that was to actually understand what happens to people. For instance, if they'd had a head injury, when somebody's had an injury, you can sort of see some of the difficulties and challenges. And that also provides information of how things happen and how our brain is functioning on an everyday level. I was also working with people with Alzheimer's disease, so working with people with all of different types of dementia. And that led to me then training as a clinical psychologist and teaching neuroscience and finding ways of actually supporting people with cognitive difficulties and emotional difficulties.
Amazing. I think that's really cool because particularly in the medical world, particularly a few years ago in the UK, there's been a lot of separation between the body and the mind, and sort of to incorporate that and to, realise that when you're looking at nursing. And it's almost that missing piece sometimes, I think, with people's health that isn't necessarily always focused on when, you're looking at individual specific conditions. I think that's really awesome.
Absolutely. And I think it was just so evident to me, because you could have two people with exactly the same physical health condition, but people would recover differently, people would listen to the information differently, they would experience emotions in a very different way. And so much was about mindset and outlook and the support system around them. And for me, I don't think you can separate the mind and body. But it's sort of reciprocal in both ways. You've got that relationship. The mind can impact the body and the body can impact the mind. So to disentangle or to try and disentangle, for me, doesn't feel right. And then when you bring compassion into that space, for me, that's just a human quality. I've always had the view that you treat people the way that you would like to be treated yourself. So that just comes with it. So it is exactly how I would want to be treated.
Yeah, that's really lovely. And I think, that just, shines through, and it's really useful clinically as well with all the work you've been doing. And obviously we're going to be talking a lot about stress and mindfulness coming up. So it'd be really good if we can have if you don't mind, a bit of a background, a brief one on what's going on in the brain, the neuroscience behind how mindfulness can be supportive, and what's going on.
So for me, I feel that mindfulness has been a really helpful intervention to help people manage stress and help people manage their overwhelming emotional sort of experiences that can be associated with suffering or fear, anxiety, and also low mood. And we know that when we're experiencing anxiety or low mood, that we're releasing neurotransmitters in the brain. They can then, in turn, have an impact on different structures and different regions within the brain. And it can then impact the way that those regions of the brain communicate with each other. So, for instance, we have a structure in the brain called the hippocampus. We have a left hippocampus and a right hippocampus. And when we're experiencing long-term stress, those particular areas of the brain lose some of their synaptic connections, and the volume of those structures changes. And those structures, the hippocampus is really important in terms of encoding new information and being able to store new memories, and before they get transferred to the rest of the cortex around the brain. So it's absolutely integral structure that's really important to the way that we think and the way that we feel. Very closely connected to that is also another structure called the amygdala. And again, we have a left and a right amygdala. And that part of the brain processes threat and also leads us to understand sort of our fears and worries. And that particular part of the brain, rather than losing connection, becomes hyper aroused and stimulated and hyperactive. So that part of the brain, if it's under a lot of stress and strain, becomes, overactive, but is also very closely related to the hippocampus. But then we have the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that has matured over time as we developmentally change through adolescence and become adults. And that part of our brain is allowing us to regulate our emotions and really sort of think about it from a cognitive point of view, and allow us to make good decisions, allow us to plan for the future, think about the past, learn from all of those things. So those three regions of the brain are very much interconnected. So when we're stressed, if you've got the hippocampus not functioning as well as it should, the hippocampus may be being hypervigilant, and then the prefrontal cortex has to work a little bit harder. So when we've got all of those regions together working sort of in synchrony, or maybe just a little bit out of that synchrony, it's really important then that we find some interventions that can sort of calm the amygdala and soothe that activation, enhance the function in the hippocampus, and allow the prefrontal cortex to have a little bit more control. And that's what mindfulness brings.
Wow. Okay, so, basically what we're saying is interventions that people can be doing every day will have a direct impact on their brain chemistry and function.
Absolutely. And they're measurable.
Yeah.
And I think for me, that's, I've always been quite skeptical about different interventions
Yeah.
unless I've got the evidence, because
Yeah.
as a science practitioner, I've always looked for evidence. Like, what does the science tell us? Where's the evidence for this? And is this something that's robust?
Yeah.
Is the science behind it rigorous and trustworthy? So when I found out myself that mindfulness had a neuroscientific basis and it could actually make changes, measurable changes. So in those particular areas that I spoke about, you actually get greater cortical thickness as a result of embedding mindfulness into your everyday life.
Excellent. That's amazing. So when we're talking about mindfulness, because people often, might be going on social media, what can I do to help my stress levels? And mindfulness comes up. So what do we actually mean by mindfulness? Because I think I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand what it means, or they think they have to, sit in a quiet room and meditate for an hour or something like that. So, what do we mean by mindfulness?
Yeah, so it's such a good question, and a lot of the time, I spend a lot of my time dispelling some of the myths to make it much more accessible and engaging, and to really highlight the benefits of mindfulness. And the things that I start out by saying that this part is a myth is that you don't have to sit down. You don't have to be cross-legged. You don't have to empty your mind. You don't have to reach a sort of a place of a higher spiritual being. Some people do, but that part of it is not essential. And that sort of notion of trying to empty your mind, I don't know if anyone's ever tried to empty their mind, but it's almost impossible.
Yeah. And as soon as you say, don't think about something or empty your mind, then you...
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's almost, impossible.
Absolutely. So, and it doesn't have to be something that's slow and methodical. So, for instance, quite a number of athletes use mindfulness, and you can take time where you sit quietly and you sort of focus in on the present moment with a little bit of curiosity, and you focus on your senses. So you're focusing on what you can see, you're focusing on what you can hear, maybe what you can touch. So for instance, I'm sitting here on this beautiful couch and everything's very soft and it's very calming, but there's also beautiful plants to look at, and the smell and all of those sensory experiences, which when we're focused on those elements of our sensory sort of environment, we're being present, we're being right there in the moment. And if we allow ourselves to really engage with that sort of experience, you're not then necessarily thinking about the past or worrying about the future. And I think this is something that I often talk about, is the fact that all of us as human beings, we're almost mental time travelers. And we don't necessarily realize that we've got this sort of unique ability, because it means that we can go back to the past. We can think about early childhood memories and experiences, which can be either really happy or quite difficult, or maybe traumatic for some people. And we can also spend time in the future, which means we can be planning for an amazing holiday that might be coming up. But also it might be that we spend maybe too much time worrying or having concerns about the future or anxiety about the future. And very rarely do we actually spend sufficient time just being in the present. Now, the other myth, even though mindfulness can actually allow you to be in the present moment, the other myth is nobody wants you to stay in the present moment. It's not that you're having to sort of anchor yourself to that moment all the time, but it's allowing you to use that when you notice that you're caught up in the past, or you're caught up in the present or in the future, and you've missed out the present moment experience. So it's about giving you flexibility and choice, that you can decide where you allow your mind to go. So it's much more dynamic. It's not a sort of a concrete state where you have to stay. I don't know if that...
Yeah, no, that does. And I think that's really lovely, that sort of idea of all the sensory impact of it as well, because there's lots of talk about being in nature, and we were talking about sound baths earlier and how how useful they are, and just being sort of brought into that moment with visual or auditory information that you can be much more aware of, I think is a really nice concept. Absolutely. As opposed to sitting in a dark room quietly, trying to empty your mind as much as possible.
And that being in nature.
Yeah.
And that really has come back into the fore at the moment in terms of encouraging people to be outdoors, to experience nature. And it really is the essence of mindfulness as far as I'm concerned, because you're hearing the birds singing. If you're walking along by a river or stream, you can hear the water. You've got all the different shades of green, or the sky and the clouds. There's so much to experience. And the key aspect of mindfulness is that you actually embrace that and you notice that with curiosity, and you try not to judge. So one of the main concepts of mindfulness is to bring your awareness to something, the present moment, without any judgment. So you're not judging whether it's a good experience or a bad experience or unpleasant. You're just noticing.
Yeah.
And when you notice with curiosity and no judgment, it gives you a little bit of space to pause and reflect before you make your decision about how you're going to respond.
Yeah, that's lovely. And I've heard that what you've said, curiosity, I can't say it now, curiosity quite a few times. And I like that idea that if you're just a bit more curious about what's going on, that sort of brings you back into that present moment.
Yeah, exactly. And I use that part of it for my own sort of mindfulness practice. On an everyday basis when I'm commuting in London. If ever I'm on a tube and you're underground and then all of a sudden the tube stops in between stations and you're there, there's lots of people on the tube and it can feel a little bit sort of uncomfortable. Yeah. If you then start focusing on what's the sensation of the texture of what I'm wearing, or what can I hear, and not to actually judge what's actually happening in that moment, it can be really calming.
Yeah.
And you can actually feel your heart rate changing. You can feel that your body is a little bit more, you're actually soothing yourself, and just being there, very present in that moment without sort of having those concerns and fears about what might happen or what hasn't happened.
Yeah.
And it can be quite liberating in that way.
Yeah, because obviously if you're stuck on a tube, you're not getting to your meeting or wherever you've got to be on time. And that's when people do start feeling that stress and that pressure, and there's nothing you can do about it. So you can potentially feel out of control. And then if you can just bring yourself back and do those sort of little techniques that you're talking about, just help. Yeah,
absolutely.
Help improve your day.
And you might also hear about people talking about being grounded. So within that as well, you can pay attention to what's happening around you, but you can also pay attention to what's actually happening in your own body, and bringing your attention through your body all the way to your feet, being sort of connected to the ground below you, and having a sense of being connected to the earth, being connected, to the community around you, and then rising up, we talk about rising up tall and dignified, and then being able to notice how you're feeling inside your body, notice where your mind is at. Like, sort of quite often we have hundreds of thoughts every day that can be about absolutely anything. Some of them can be quite random, but noticing your thoughts, maybe letting some of them settle, and then focusing on the sights and the sounds around you. And it becomes really powerful.
Yeah.
It's quite gentle, but it's really powerful.
Yeah. And actually, I wonder if we've lost a lot of that connection in a lot of modern society, which I'll probably ask you about a bit later on as well. But yeah, it feels like a lot of people have become disconnected with their external environment, and aren't quite as able to feel that groundedness and connection to other people and connection to the earth.
I agree. And I think I don't know, it is an observation, but because I do a lot of commuting and I'm on a train or on the tube going to work and backwards and forwards to London, when you sit on a train nowadays, whereas people used to be sitting on a train reading a newspaper, everybody's on their mobile device or on a laptop. And very rarely do people actually sort of communicate on the train.
Yeah.
Very rarely enter into a conversation with a stranger or even make eye contact.
Yeah.
So,
I know. I think, we're probably going to be realising the impact of that more and more as we go forward, I would imagine.
sure.
So we've talked about mindfulness, but are there any sort of risks or safety concerns when we're thinking about utilising mindfulness, or, how can we do it safely?
Yeah. I'm actually really glad you've asked that question because, again, going back to being a nurse, any intervention that has a benefit has the potential of also having a side effect.
Yeah.
And that's just a natural consequence of something having an impact. And mindfulness is no different to that. And quite often, there are some temporary side effects with mindfulness. And actually, this speaks to some of the research. So it's a really important point. But if you start to become aware of how you're feeling, if you start to become aware of your anxieties or your low mood, and you start to really become curious as to why and how, you could then understand temporarily, before you then develop the tools to regulate that there could be a little bit of a dip. It might make your mood worse for a while because you're now focusing on your mood and you're focusing on the fact that things have been really tough or that you've had some unfortunate circumstances to deal with. So it's not unnatural or unusual for people to feel temporarily worse before they start to feel better. So that's the first thing that I would highlight. I would also highlight, because of that, it means that mindfulness isn't always for everyone, and maybe sometimes the timing might not be right. So, for instance, if you've just experienced a bereavement, I personally wouldn't recommend sort of engaging with mindfulness at that acute period of time, because it's going to be incredibly sad and there's going to be a huge amount of grief. And that's a natural process which people need to experience and feel without trying to make it go away, particularly at the very beginning. There can also be times when there might be individuals who are taking different medications, and they might need to just get some advice if there's any sort of interaction with the medication. And I'm thinking in particular if somebody has had a diagnosis of a psychosis. And also, it's not that mindfulness isn't appropriate for somebody who has experienced psychosis, but you would need somebody who has had a lot of experience or expertise in working with people who've experienced psychosis, because, again, there are parts of mindfulness where you're exploring your thoughts. And one of the things that we actually encourage people to think about is that you can have a thought, you don't have to get into that thought, and you can let it go, and that you are not your thoughts. Now, that can be a really liberating idea, but it can also be quite disconcerting. And if you've experienced psychosis and your sense of reality might be a little bit sort of distorted, thinking that you're not then your thoughts can actually add to that sort of experience of not knowing where you're sort of what you're connected to. So that's why it has to be delivered with a lot of understanding and sensitivity and expertise. So that, again, can be a side effect. And again, quite often, if somebody has been experiencing acute depression for a long time, or if somebody has been experiencing suicide thoughts, again, you'd want to be really careful about the timing and the expertise of the practitioners delivering mindfulness at that time.
Yeah, thank you. That's really important to be aware of.
Yeah.
So I'm glad I asked you that question as well.
Thank
so that's
you.
Excellent. Sort of not moving on from that, but sort of associated with that, because I think talking about awareness of how you're feeling, I think there is a lot more awareness about mental health and mental health conditions. And I know in some instances in the media, there's a bit of a thing where they go, it's either over-diagnosed and over-medicalised. Obviously, we're not talking about extreme conditions like psychosis, which is obviously really important to get support for. So in the modern world, I guess, I wonder if we are more stressed. Are we just more aware of it? And also, I sometimes feel like this is just a personal thing that you might have a different opinion, but we're often very focused on what's bad for our mental health. Don't do this. Don't let your kids go on social media, which may be important, but we're not sort of looking at what we need to do to actually be mentally well. We're just so there's quite a big focus on, poor mental health, but there's not necessarily always quite so much focus on, this is what it means to have good mental health. So I don't know if you've got any comments to make on that. I've sort of just thrown a load of different stuff at you there.
And I really do wish I had all the answers to those questions, because they are so important and so prominent at the moment in everybody's consciousness.
Yeah.
And I think we're living in a society at the moment where ideas and beliefs and thoughts are quite polarized. And what tends to happen is you either have a group of people who think we are much more stressed today and life is more complicated and much more complex, and no wonder we're stressed. And then you have the other sort of side of that where people are like, well, we should just be like gritting our teeth and just getting through it, and everyone needs to be more resilient. And in my day, it was very different. And I work with a lot of young people. I'm a lecturer at university, and I also have a private practice. So I specialize in working with young people who may have a neurodivergent sort of cognitive profile, so autism or ADHD, and also young people who have experienced trauma and experience anxiety and stress. So I'm really connected to that sort of generation. Plus, I have my own children who have also gone through those sort of stages. And I have a lot of sympathy for young people nowadays. I genuinely feel that life is much more complex. There are so many global issues that young people are now aware of. The news is 24/7. You can't escape the news. The news is difficult and challenging in many ways for people to engage with or disengage from. There's a sense that life is so different for young people now. I was only talking to a colleague the other day and talking about, back in the 80s, how much you could buy a property for compared to, and, there's been this exponential, like, sort of price sort of change for property. So young people don't have the same opportunities. They're now encouraged to go to university. Alongside that, there's added financial pressures and a change in their independence levels. I feel that they're much more aware, much more sensitive. They feel concerned about the planet and climate change, and they want to make a difference, but they also know that the world is also a different place. They don't have the same freedom that we used to have. I mean, we could be out all day and no one would know where you were. But they now have replaced that freedom with a freedom on social media. And that has completely different risks and challenges. But the one thing which I think is really important is that when I was talking about the amygdala earlier, and that's our threat detection, from an evolutionary perspective, that helped us in terms of being aware of predators so that we would be alert to our environment. Now, we don't have to be vigilant to that anymore, but the threat is now social judgment. That is the threat as a human being. Now, being on social media, that environment gives us that sort of perfect environment in terms of being surrounded by social judgment constantly. And you're comparing yourself with others, you're being compared, you're being you're just experiencing a completely different world. And your experiences are then indelibly preserved forever. So I think young people have got a lot to deal with, and I'm not surprised that they're experiencing more mental health difficulties because they are genuinely concerned and that can lead to anxiety, and it can lead to changes in their mood. But on the other side of that, I do feel that some of our sort of mental health terminology has now changed a little bit in terms of, we all talk about, oh, that's trauma, or I'm anxious, or I've got anxiety, or I'm depressed, in a way that we probably wouldn't have spoken about that before. So there are elements of maybe using the words too frequently in settings that might not necessarily be, but that doesn't mean to say that they're not experiencing those mental health challenges.
Yeah.
So
No, I personally really agree with that, but you just explained that so eloquently. So I think that was really, no, you did. That's really lovely. But I agree that there are a lot more, the stress, like you say, the stress response was, when we were hunter-gatherers, have we got enough food? Have we got shelter? Or are we being chased by a predator? And now it's much more complex in, modern society.
Yeah.
And we're kind of still working out how to deal with that. And the world is changing at a much faster pace than it ever used to. I mean, changes even in the last 50 years or even the last 5 or 10 years have been enormous compared to, 1,000 years ago. Those changes would be much sort of slower and more gradual, and you wouldn't necessarily notice it from generation to generation.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Exactly that. And obviously every generation has its own new thing that the previous generation thinks is going to be a threat to, the health of the whole generation that's coming through, whether it was rock music back in the 50s, whether it was the invention of TV or phones or mobile phones. But now, we also have another sort of almost a revolution in terms of artificial intelligence, and how that's also going to impact the way that we can detect whether something is real, whether it's fake. It's again much harder. I mean, we had a lot more trust in what we saw, maybe wrongly. We just trusted everything, but now we're going to have to relearn the way that we engage with social media as well. And that's also really stressful cognitively, having to always evaluate what we see and may not being able to believe our own eyes and our own ears, which again brings us back to being in nature. There's something really soothing, comforting about being, that is real, and we can trust that experience.
Yeah, I think so. And I agree. But also I wonder if there's going to be a bit of a revolution again. I'm hoping there may be, where we're going to sort of start turning away from this because of all these other things. But obviously there's a big tide to turn when it comes to that.
And again, that notion of needing to feel connected with our own selves, our bodies, our minds, but also each other, families, friends, and feeling connected globally. And in some ways we are much more connected in that way, but then feeling more disconnected. So there's a real sort of paradox there, which I don't think we've actually completely understood or found ways to actually resolve that adequately. So there's still a lot of work for all of us to sort of do.
Definitely. Definitely. So I think, we had a chat sort of before this, and one thing you said, which I really liked, I don't know if you can expand on it, is that babies are born mindful. So I don't know if you could talk about that a little bit more, and then how do we sort of change throughout life, and, when do we stop becoming quite so mindful?
No, absolutely. And I remember that feeling. And I think when you are near a baby or observing a baby, they're curious. Everything, and you can see their eyes like widen when they see something new. So novelty, and everything feels new, and it's all novel. So they want to explore, they pick something up, and you can see that they're properly gazing and trying to understand and looking at it in terms of its texture, its shape. They taste it, they sort of throw it, they listen to the noise that it can make. And that actually is and that continues through early years of just almost being like a scientist in interacting with the world and trying to figure out what it means, what it does. Can you eat it? Can you, all those sorts of things. And as we go through the education system, we sort of lose some of that curiosity. But when we start school, we have to sit down and you have to be paying attention for a long period of time. So you've got outside constraints that take away that need for exploration and flexibility. And it's really interesting because within mindfulness, if there are different ways of practicing mindfulness, and I can talk a little bit more about that too. But if you were engaging in a traditional program of mindfulness where you might sort of enroll on an 8-week program, which is 2 hours every week, and then you do work in between those sessions, one of the first things that happens on a mindfulness training course is that you have practices and exercises where you have to explore something with your eyes, your ears, your mouth, and really think about what came up for you in your mind, what sort of expectations you had. So it's almost like taking you back to almost being a baby again. Imagine you're seeing something for the very first time. How do you know what it looks like? Like, how can you examine it? And just encouraging you to just be really curious and explore. Yeah. So it's really interesting that sort of is part of the very first stage of mindfulness, bringing that curiosity and exploration and experimentation back.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess it's so important for like the cognitive development, the neuroscience, and is that part of it? Is that mindfulness process probably part of the...
Yeah, completely. Because you need to be able to explore, you need to understand the way the world works, and then you need to store it and remember it. And then the next time something similar happens, then you've got pre-existing knowledge to guide you in terms of what to expect. But then there might be new things that come that are completely different. And so the brain can adjust and sort of incorporate that as well. Yeah. But I think as we get older and then we start going to work and we start doing different things, and you're juggling maybe work life, home life, financial pressures, all of the things that we're trying to juggle on a daily basis now, you actually forget to notice things along the way. And I was talking to you about coming up on the train today and taking the opportunity to actually just sit and look out the window rather than sort of, the temptation was to do some work and to get a few things completed. But at the same time, just being able to look out the window and just watch the world pass by, and on a beautiful sunny day, and looking at, and particularly with the beginning of autumn, it's like the colours are changing. It's, you've got the sunshine. It was just beautiful. And we don't have as much capacity or time or space for that exploration and just being there and just being. Yeah. Essentially.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, it's obviously, as a nutritional therapist, I talk to a lot of people, particularly in their probably more 40s and 50s, but maybe in their 30s as well, that have children, they're working, they may have aging parents, there's financial commitments. And I find that they're really struggling actually with whatever we want to call it, stress or mental health. And it's also, they're really restricted on that time front. So finding ways they can incorporate, maybe we'll talk about that in a bit later, but mindfulness into their lives can be really helpful. But I think often, as you're saying, we can lose that. We don't necessarily sit on the train and think, oh, I'll sit and look out the window. Exactly. It feels to a lot of people like wasted time.
It does. And I have a very strong sense of that isn't wasted time, because I think when it can be quite restorative. Yeah. And for me, it provides you with more space after you've had that experience. You actually feel refreshed and maybe rejuvenated. And it just allows things to settle a little bit. Yeah. But I completely agree with you. I think that particular stage in life, it's almost like you're sandwiched between different generations and you're trying to do everything and multitask, and it's exhausting.
Yeah.
And, there's the impact of, burnout. There's the impact of, what general everyday worries and pressures that people have to navigate. And absolutely, it's not easy. And then when I talk about sort of doing mindfulness, and particularly with some of the traditional programs, which need 2 hours a week for 8 weeks, not everybody has the time to even embark on that. So we also have to be flexible as mindfulness practitioners and think about different ways of engaging with people to give them the skills, or to remind them of those skills that they've lost when they were young.
Yeah. And maybe you've already answered this. Does the way we should be, or I don't want to say should be, but the way we practice mindfulness change throughout our lives? And there are sort of different times where it may be, obviously we're more mindful as a baby, but does that change throughout life, if that makes sense?
I think it does. And I recently had the pleasure of designing a shortened mindfulness program, because I feel really strongly that we have to have flexibility, and we have to not try and get people to join in with that traditional delivery, but we have to accommodate and adjust for people's circumstances.
Yeah.
And because I work with a number of different clinical groups of people who might have neurological difficulty, so they might have a memory difficulty or an executive function difficulty, it's quite difficult then for those people to remember and to engage for 2 hours. That's quite a long time. So I modified the traditional course and made it a little bit shorter and a little bit more accessible for people who might have difficulties processing information. And I had the opportunity of delivering that to people with spina bifida and hydrocephalus, but also people with dementia and older generations. And it was probably my favorite ever mindfulness course, because when I was working with people, and I think every participant was over the age of 80, and a few of the people in the sort of hospital were thinking, do you really need to be doing this? And I'm like, absolutely. This, for me, feels really important. And within 2 weeks, in a much shorter session, I actually had a lady who came back to the session, and she was sharing her experiences with the group. And on her way home, she'd actually gone barefoot in the park, and she'd bought herself an ice cream and then sat under a tree and just took that time for herself, and said that she'd never had an ice cream that tasted so good, and to feel the grass on the soles of her feet took her back to being a child. And she said why had she gone throughout her whole life without going back to that sort of childhood experience? So there was a little bit of remorse that she hadn't done that, but then she was really grateful for the fact that she could now incorporate just being barefoot on the grass and enjoying an ice cream. Other people, and quite often when we're trying to think of new ways of just encouraging people to be mindful in their everyday experience, you can be mindful just when you're washing up. It's sort of thinking about what it feels like with the washing up suds, or the temperature of the water, cleaning the plates, and what that, and being not thinking about anything else, about what you have to do or what you've been doing, but just being present with that task. I don't know if you've seen the programme Gone Fishing with Bob Mortimer and Paul Whitehouse. A perfect example of a mindfulness experience and practice. Sitting, again, it's in nature, sitting on a riverbank, talking, being connected, and sharing experiences. They're sharing a cup of tea, they're sharing something to eat, and they're having a laugh, but they're also being human. It can also just be pausing for a moment and just taking a moment just to check in with yourself. what am I experiencing in my body at this moment? What am I worried about? And just that check in, and then starting again. So you can bring it in so many different ways.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. And I like that sort of idea of the fishing. And I think often people have naturally done things like that in their lives. You know, they see their hobbies as, you know, it's whatever you want to call it, their sort of relaxation period, their escape. But actually, what it is actually being really mindful and having connection with those other people, with friends, and just living in that moment. I think that's what a lot of that brings to people. So they've often naturally gravitated towards that without being necessarily aware that that's a mindful process.
Exactly. And sometimes now I get the experience of, if you talk about mindfulness to some people, you see people's eyes roll, and it's like, and it's almost, particularly young people now, because they've introduced mindfulness in schools.
Yeah.
And so if I speak to one of my clients who has come for therapy and I mention mindfulness, they really they groan, because everyone's talking about mindfulness, and they're a bit fed up of hearing about it, actually. Which is a real shame. But, and actually I've got something else to say about that as well in a second. But it's sort of, I think there's a real case of finding the hook that works for each individual. Now, for me, it was the fact of the neuroscience. When I found out that mindfulness affected my brain and was going to have measurable changes and affect different regions of my brain, I found that fascinating, and I wanted to know more. Other people, it could be that if it's an activity that they're already doing and they realize that that's mindfulness, that can be really therapeutic. But it could be you introduce something new, knitting, baking, even running, you know, and I think that's the other thing. It doesn't have to be slow. You can run, you know, sort of, I don't know, however far people like to run, but you can do things at speed. You can cycle, you can swim, feeling the water on your body. You can sort of find and locate a different part of your body and sort of really tune into that, and what does it feel like, and feeling your body moving through the water can be a really mindful experience. So it doesn't have to be, very regimented, but it can be very much tailored to the individual and their preference.
Yeah. And I think sometimes as well, if someone's stressed, you go and you maybe Dr. Google, go and Google, what should I do if I'm stressed? And mindfulness comes up, and then someone goes, oh, right, well, I've got to meditate for 2 hours, and then I've got to do my exercise, and then I've got to, you know, cook not that there's anything wrong with cooking a really healthy meal, and that's almost overwhelming for people. And sometimes they get more stressed trying to deal with the stress and being aware of it. So those, like you say, those little hooks, I think are really...
And if you
lovely.
think about, you know, if you do enjoy cooking, then you don't have to go and do something else. You can just realize just how mindful cookery can be. It's like, you know, preparing the veg and watching, you know, the fact that you create something and you've got the sensory experience of the smells and the colours and the texture, and then you've got a meal to eat at the end of it. It's like, what's not to love?
Yeah, exactly.
But I'm also really keen to also emphasize the fact that mindfulness really does need to be almost like an invitation. I never think it should just be sort of, you know, delivered to everybody, whether they want it or not. And I think, so when I was talking about young people earlier, I think one of the mistakes is to think, okay, we've got this mental health issue. Mindfulness is reasonably inexpensive compared to medication or other things. Let's just bring it into schools and give it to everybody. And for me, that goes against the whole ethos, the whole philosophy. You need it to land at the right point in someone's life. And it shouldn't be something that people are forced to do. So for me, there's been quite a few research findings recently that has said that mindfulness doesn't work for young people. If children have been made to do mindfulness, they're not going to engage with it in the same way. But also, if for a younger person that they've had that dip that I was talking about earlier, you could be assessing them at that point where they still haven't processed it, maybe as quickly as an adult would. So then you can make the conclusion, well, mindfulness hasn't worked. Well, maybe it has. It's just working at a different speed or in a different way, or it wasn't right for that child at that time, and particularly not together with all their peers. So I think we have to be a little bit more creative and a little bit more innovative in the way that we connect with young people.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's often a bit of a, not a blockage with research, but that can be an issue where it's just the way in which the study's been done, as it doesn't always quite work, and it hasn't necessarily been designed the way that it would showcase the benefits properly. So that's always something. And it's great that you're involved in all your excellent research. So just talking about gone fishing with Bob Mortimer and Paul Whitehouse, obviously they're two men, and I think, fishing is often seen as a bit of a male activity. Obviously, no judgment or discrimination here, but often it is. Is there a difference between men and women when it comes to mindfulness, or do you think maybe men feel potentially that it's not as suitable for them as for women? And what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, again, I think we have a lot of misconceptions.
Yeah.
So quite often when I'm sort of doing research in mindfulness, I have people coming up to me and saying, yeah, but men won't enjoy mindfulness. It's not something that men will like. And I always challenge that idea, because for me, I think men do enjoy mindful activities and practices. But I think it's really important that they find a sort of a mindful practice or an activity that is their preference, something that's working for them. And I think quite often for men, they're engaging in activities that are incredibly mindful. For instance, when you think about men playing golf, all of these things are very mindful. And again, I think there is an opportunity then for men to really sort of focus a little bit more on their sort of internal sensations and experiences. That particular sort of context is ripe for conversations. But I think maybe men just maybe need a little bit more of a nudge to maybe engage in some of those conversations. I mean, I know in my research, I've had plenty of opportunities to work with men in lots of difficult situations, whether it's physical health or mental health. And when you provide men with space and that sort of opportunity to speak in a safe place, men relish that opportunity to talk about difficulties. But if you don't provide that space, or if you don't provide those activities, then you might be missing out in being able to just put the right context in place.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Just knowing that they can, they can do that. They're kind of, it's almost allowing them, is giving them that space.
Absolutely. I think you're definitely onto something there. And again, when I talk about a mindfulness program, you start off with maybe a mindful eating practice. You then get into the body and you do a body scan. But then there's also mindful movement. So and again, within that, there is that understanding that when your body is moving, you're synchronizing the two hemispheres of the brain. So if you're walking or if you're running or swimming, you're activating both sides, and that's synchronized, which is really helpful in terms of mentalizing and reflecting and thinking about things. But also you can do that when you're running or doing something really like at speed as well. So again, it doesn't have to be slow. It could be dancing, for instance. And then you've got the music coming into that as well. But when you move your body, I think that can be really helpful. And when I was working with the group of individuals who had spina bifida and hydrocephalus, some of those individuals may have been wheelchair bound, for instance, and had experienced a lot of investigations and procedures that were happening to them and happening to their bodies. And quite often you'd find that people were thinking all the time and just ruminating, so where you just can't stop thinking about the same thing over and over, which can then sort of interrupt your sleep and getting off to sleep. But if you then encourage people to then get into their body, then you can actually sort of incorporate the whole individual, and then that is really good for mental health and to be able to calm and soothe. So I think that's really important, and maybe that is something even more important for men to be able to do as well.
Yeah. So we've sort of mentioned, we talked a lot about mindfulness and through the ages, but obviously a lot of the study, the work that you're doing also looks at, specific conditions. I know we touched on, dementia and anxiety, and you've done a lot on trauma as well. Can you, sort of, this is a very broad question, but give us a bit of an insight into,
Sure.
your findings and what you found helpful.
So we've also done some studies with young people in an inner city school in London, offering children the opportunity to bring mindfulness into their sort of citizenship classes and also yoga. And again, just allowing the children to experience those sorts of things. And what we found, and one of the ways that we designed the study was to make sure that we weren't just measuring, sort of, did this improve? Did that go up or down on a particular survey or a questionnaire? We also interviewed the children afterwards and sort of tried to find out their experience. So some mixed methods and qualitative research as well. And some of the findings were really interesting because it really depended not just on the intervention, but also on the person delivering. So they wanted to feel connected with that person. They wanted to make sure that it felt authentic. They didn't want it to be sort of regimented. Yeah. So if they felt that the person really cared about them, they engaged a little bit more with that as well. So there were lots of other factors, not just the mindfulness and not just the yoga. The main finding was at the end of the study, they really didn't want it to end. And that was, for me, one of the downsides of doing research, because you bring in an intervention and when it does help certain people, the study comes to an end and then you're sort of taking it away, and that ethically feels really uncomfortable. But we were also able to encourage the teachers to also learn those practices and share them and embed them in the classroom, like come and sit down, get your feet on the ground, feel grounded, feel your body, allow your mind to settle, observe your thoughts, and regulate your emotion. And those sorts of things were really helpful. But within that as well, we also made sure that we also talked about compassion. Yeah. And whenever I'm talking about mindfulness, we always bring that compassion in as well. I don't think you can have one sort of without the other. Yeah. And with compassion, there's also that sense of a shared humanity that when people talk to each other a little bit more, and this comes back to that connection, if we're not sharing things, we think we're the only ones that are suffering or the only ones that's got this problem. But actually, when you share your experience, other people will also, and that was also happening with the children. We've also done some research working with people with dementia and their carers, and also people with traumatic brain injury and their carers. And both of those studies were designed quite differently. The one with people with dementia, the groups were separated. So the individuals with dementia were in one group and their carers were in another. With the people with brain injury and their carers, we delivered the mindfulness to everybody together. So carers and the individuals were there. And one of the findings was for the individuals with brain injury, when their carers were there as well, it had mutually beneficial effects because it meant that each person could understand the other. And you could really see the carers understanding the impact of brain injury, not just for their own loved one, but also for other people in the group. and then they were able to connect with the other carers. And then the person with brain injury could also share how they felt like they were a burden, and it was really emotional, and to have that shared humanity and to have those practices that you could bring in when things felt overwhelming. So that was incredible. And we also used a very similar experience working with people who'd been diagnosed with cancer, and being able to bring mindfulness and compassion into their lives, because quite often what we found in that group of individuals was the people didn't necessarily want compassion coming in because it made them feel too vulnerable, and they felt that they were holding everything together, and if someone was going to come along and be too nice, it was they're going to let their guard down, so they became a little bit sort of distant. And again, that's quite hard for people, because again, people want to have that flexibility when they choose when to feel emotional and when not to feel emotional. So there's a lot of respect and understanding, and just tailoring things for individuals. So we've had lots of experience of working with all of these different groups, which is incredible, and also students at university, young people in schools, and then I also work one-to-one with people and just bring in some mindfulness. Tried it in my own family, but no one in my family wants anything to do with mindfulness. Unfortunately, it's always the way when it's something that you do yourself. But actually my daughter did come back one day and say, actually somebody suggested mindfulness, and I'm like, oh really? But yes, I don't mind how it happens as long as somebody can bring it to you. And then recently I've also had an amazing opportunity of bringing mindfulness to Glastonbury, of all places.
Yes,
which
excellent.
is incredible experience. And I've been working with a colleague of mine, Professor Gillian Forrester, who's at the University of Sussex, and we work at Glastonbury Festival bringing science to festival goers. What's been really interesting is that we've brought a number of our research studies to the festival. So I've been able to give talks, demonstrations, and festival goers come along to the science field. They lie down, they listen to a few mindfulness practices, and then they go back and have the most amazing time. So that's been amazing experience too. So it really is, available for anybody in lots of different settings if it feels right for them in that moment.
How was that received at Glastonbury? Was it?
I think it was interesting. There was some skepticism at the beginning of no one is going to want to be, but actually, I mean, and maybe I also had some misconceptions, but particularly on the first time I ever went to Glastonbury. But there were whole fields dedicated to wellness. There's yoga, there's all sorts of, sound baths, there's all sorts of different experiences for people at Glastonbury. It's a huge festival. And those festival goers were really interested in science. And then this year, working with a company called Face Space, who have virtual reality headsets, and we took those to Glastonbury as part of Science Futures. So we bring mindfulness and compassion, EMDR, virtual reality, like all sorts of things. But again, everything designed to support people with stress and anxiety, because Glastonbury can actually be quite overwhelming for some people.
No, that's amazing. I think that's really cool. And all of that is. So I was sort of thinking when you were talking about Glastonbury, is that quite a mindful experience generally? I mean, you are very listening to music or being in that, crowd with music with lots of other people that are having the same experience as you.
Exactly that. And that for me is one of the things. So for me, it has everything. You're in nature. You've got lots of people around. If you've got that live music experience, but then you've got the synchronicity of a whole crowd of people all connected in that moment. And it just takes you to a different place.
Yeah.
So I think it's incredibly mindful
Yeah.
and absolutely perfectly designed for Glastonbury.
Yeah, no, you're making me want to go this year now.
It's a fallow year next year, so I have to wait 2 years for my next opportunity.
Oh, what an experience. You've sort of mentioned quite a bit about compassion. We haven't really talked about it too much because there's a lot, I've seen a lot of stuff anyway about self-compassion, because I know we talk about compassion with others, but can you sort of just explain a bit what self-compassion means?
Yeah, absolutely. And it can be really hard, actually, because as a nurse, for instance, I obviously skilled in being compassionate to others. And so that part of compassion, particularly for me, comes quite easy. Self-compassion, I think people have misconceptions and perceptions about self-compassion, depending on somebody's upbringing.
Yeah.
If you're brought up in a family that values hard work, you strive, you're aiming for perfection, you need to be a high achiever, there might not be very much room to be self-compassionate. Other families, in terms of upbringing, might be very compassionate and understanding, and sort of as long as you're happy and you do your best. So some of those beliefs and value systems can be really influential in terms of how people receive compassion and how they develop and cultivate self-compassion. And some people view it as a weakness, something that you shouldn't, or it's too self-absorbed, or you're too, weak or something. But actually, for me, it's a strength. And I bring compassion to myself, to others, and accepting compassion from others is still a little bit tricky, because I think, again, it's that it can penetrate and make you feel really like sort of it opens out all of your emotion when somebody really understands you and offers compassion, because it's not just a sort of a there. It's a really authentic connection and understanding of your suffering. So it's really powerful. But quite often, particularly with mental health difficulties, a lack of self-compassion can be something that contributes to the maintenance of a mental health difficulty. So bringing in self-compassion can allow people to work with shame. It can allow people to work with their own guilt or their fears, and that they haven't reached their potential or they haven't met perfection. And that's quite a hard one to work with as well, when people do have that sense of perfectionism, because it starts off as something that's really beneficial, because it's good to strive and it's good to do well, but it can tip over and be quite detrimental if there isn't some sort of flexibility and compassion, because the more complex the world gets, and as you work in a more complex environment, you can't be perfect at everything. It's like going to university, for instance. You can't read every paper, you can't read every book, you can't sort of be perfect in every single assignment because there's too many. So you have to figure out a way of being compassionate to yourself and being good enough, as opposed to being perfect at everything. And so these are skills that can be learned and developed and cultivated. And when you're mindful as well as compassionate, those two things together really emphasize, a clearer understanding of the self, and it allows you to flourish.
Yeah.
It doesn't give you an excuse. It actually makes you stronger.
Yeah. That's amazing. And obviously we probably, talk about that for another 3 hours.
I know. Easily.
Yeah. So we sort of talked about your research, and we're probably coming to an end, but where would you like to go from here with the work that you're doing? Or is there anything you sort of would like to delve into that you haven't looked at yet?
That is a lovely question for us to sort of start thinking about coming to an end. For me, I've always felt that my work So my teaching, my research and my clinical work there's always been a thread that has connected everything. So, and they all inform each other. So I bring my research into my teaching, and I bring the teaching and the research into working clinically, and vice versa. And now a lot of my clinical work is focused on neurodivergent cognitive profiles and the difficulties that neurodivergent individuals are experiencing in a world that doesn't always accommodate them in the way that it needs to, in terms of their different processing styles and their ability to engage in a really demanding, exhausting world. So quite often, autistic individuals and people with ADHD really struggle with mindfulness, mainly because it hasn't been tailored to those groups. So, for instance, somebody who has ADHD, if you tell them to sit and be grounded and just focus on one thing, that would actually cause a lot of discomfort, and that person would find it pretty impossible to just focus on one thing. But if you understand the neuroscience and the condition, then you could actually get them to focus on maybe 4 things at the same time, and that can then be mindful for them. But it's working with the person to find out how that's going to work. And the same with somebody with autism. They might find it really challenging to be mindful because they're also processing everything in minute detail, and you need to be able to allow them to be able to do that. So for me, I bring in my mindfulness and compassion in that sort of neurodivergent sort of profile. But I know that there's a lot more work to do in order to be able to make sure that people can engage and it's accessible and it's inclusive. Females with autism, for instance, present in a very different way to males with autism. So it's making sure that we're really inclusive and just tailoring it so that it actually suits the people that we're working with. So that's what we're doing at the moment.
Oh, that's amazing. And that really falls into that compassionate, element that you were talking about. Right, and this, I might be putting you on the spot here, but if there was if someone, wants to become more mindful, feeling quite stressed and overwhelmed, what's one thing that they could, you don't have to give me just one specific thing, but how can they start?
I've got 3.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. Three's fine.
If you enjoy a cup of tea or coffee, drink it mindfully, or eat your meals mindfully, rather than sort of watching TV without actually paying attention or really savouring that cup of tea. So that's 1. Sort of 2, eating and drinking. Secondly, having a shower in the morning. Feel the drops of water, feel them on your skin. Have a shower gel that has got a really nice aroma. So then it becomes a sensory experience. And rather than planning, be present. Enjoy that shower. That would be the second. And any opportunity you have to be able to take your shoes and socks off, or even, if the soles of your feet are tricky in whatever way, maybe just using your hands, but connecting with the earth, feeling the grass, going to a local park or a garden and just touching grass, looking at the trees, connecting with nature. If there's opportunity to garden or any of those sorts of things, then that would be the third.
Amazing. It's been such a joy speaking with you today, Trudi. It's been really, really good. And now I'm going to have a cup of tea, a shower, walk in the forest, but also I've got to book my tickets for Glastonbury, but 2027.
Oh, there you go. There you go. That's it.
That's lovely. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And it's been excellent. So,
thank you. And thank you for asking really fascinating questions. There's so much to talk about, so much to unpack. But the questions have been really helpful and insightful. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I feel like we've just scratched the surface. We could talk for another
few
hours.
There's a lot more. Definitely.
Lovely. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Beyond the Capsule. Don't forget to like and subscribe. If this conversation has sparked any thoughts or questions and you'd like to learn more, don't hesitate to get in touch with our nutritional therapists at nutrition@cytoplan.co.uk. We're Cytoplan, inspired by nature, proven by science, and driven by purpose.